Ever get that feeling? Like you're drowning in to-dos and each one is another chunk of your life. You think, wait, is this it?
Oh, tell me about it. Deadlines, errands, that never-ending grocery list. It's like,
Hmm.
where's the pause button?
Right. And it's not just the busyness. It's like this deeper worry about time slipping away. We don't
That-
talk about it much. But that fear of our own, well, you know,
That's
finiteness.
the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah,
Everyone feels it, but nobody wants to address it directly.
exactly. Which is why this deep dive is so fascinating, I think. We're going behind the scenes of a conversation, Professor John Hu and his student, Albina.
Professor Who, familiar name, he's that sociologist, right? Writes
Yeah,
about anxiety and...
that's the one. And their dialogue. It's about this very fear. Except it gets way deeper than you might expect. We're talking philosophy, psychology, even a dash of Kabbalah.
Okay, now you got my attention. Kabbalah and existential dread. Lay it on me.
So it all starts with Professor Hu kind of having this mini crisis about getting older. That classic feeling of the years just flying by faster and
Well, it's
faster.
pretty blinked and suddenly you're closer to your high school reunion than graduation. Yeah, I get it.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is Professor Hu isn't alone in this. It speaks to this really common fear we all have, that the future is shrinking faster than the past is growing.
Which makes us feel totally out of control, like we're clinging onto this runaway train.
And psychologists actually have a name for it, mortality salience. Basically, it's this awareness, even subconscious, that our time is limited and it impacts everything. Our decisions, our relationships, even how we see ourselves in the grand scheme of things.
So that pressure to make every moment count, to squeeze the most out of life, that's partly this mortality salience thing.
Bingo. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Albina, she's sharp, this student. She points out it's not just about physical death. It's this deeper fear of disappearing entirely.
Disappearing, like what does she mean by that?
Having no impact, leaving no mark, like poof, you're gone, and the world just keeps spinning without a trace of you.
Oh, wow. Okay, that hit a nerve. And it's like, we all want to know our lives meant something, right?
Right. It's like this innate human need to leave some kind of legacy. And what's interesting? This lines up with some Kabbalistic ideas, too. There's this whole concept of the ego, the I, wanting to continue even beyond our physical existence.
So it's not even just about living a long life, it's about living a meaningful one. One that echoes even after we're gone.
That's exactly it. But then that begs the question, how do you define meaning? Where do you even begin?
$1,000,000 question right there. And not one with an easy answer.
And that's something Professor Hu really struggles with. He even talks about how this fear of disappearing, it fuels him. Like he's constantly driven to achieve, create, almost like he's trying to outrun oblivion through accomplishment.
Oh, I know that feeling. It's like that hamster wheel of success. You reach one goal and boom, there are 5 more just out of reach. Exhausting.
Totally. And you can see how that, while maybe motivating in the short term, could become its own kind of prison, right?
For sure. Always chasing the next thing, never really stopping to appreciate what you've already done.
And this is where things take a bit of an unexpected turn. Professor Hu has this aha moment where he realizes that Mortito, that often misunderstood death drive.
Hold on, death drive. Okay, I'm going to need a quick refresher. For those of us who haven't exactly cracked open our Freud lately, what are we talking about here?
Well, think of it less as a literal desire to die and more like this inherent awareness we all have of our own mortality.
Right.
And what Professor Hu realizes is it's not something to be feared, but a necessary counterbalance
Counterbalance to what?
to libido, to our life force, our desire to create, connect, experience joy. He mentions this thing called Tolkachev's principle, this idea that opposing forces are what create momentum. You need that tension on a bowstring to launch the arrow.
Okay, I think I'm starting to follow. So it's not about wanting to die. It's about confronting the reality of death, and that somehow helps us really live.
So you're telling me that voice in the back of our heads whispering, time's running out, that's actually what can push us to make the most of it.
That's the irony, right? It's like this fear we try so hard to avoid, it might actually hold the key to a more fulfilling life.
Okay, I'm really intrigued now. So if fear is the engine, what's the fuel? What are we supposed to do with all that energy to make it mean something?
Well, Albina, she hits on something really powerful here. She says the fear itself, the things we're most afraid of losing, those are often the biggest clues to what we truly desire deep down.
I think I get it. Like, if I'm terrified of being forgotten, maybe deep down it means I crave connection, making a positive impact on the world.
Exactly. And she uses this phrase, it's kind of stuck with me. She talks about finding the eternal symbol within ourselves.
Eternal symbol. Now, that's a phrase that really makes you think, right? It's like she's saying there's this essence inside each of us that's bigger than any fleeting accomplishment. But what does that actually look like in real life? How do we even begin to find that?
And that's the million-dollar question, right? And honestly, I don't think there's one right answer, but I think it starts with some serious introspection. What are the principles you want to live by? What kind of impact do you want to have on the world? What makes you, you at the deepest level?
So it's not necessarily about, like, building pyramids or composing symphonies. It could be as simple as just being a supportive friend, a loving parent,
Yeah.
a compassionate person in your everyday life, right?
Exactly. It's about aligning your actions with your core beliefs, whatever those may be. And I think that alignment, that sense of congruence between who you are on the inside and how you're showing up in the world, that's where that eternal part comes in. Because those values, that inner compass, those transcend any one specific achievement. And that brings us to another important point they make, this idea of connecting to something larger than ourselves.
You mean like finding purpose in something outside our own individual ego-driven desires?
Exactly. Whether that's through spirituality, community involvement, dedicating yourself to a cause you believe in, it's about tapping into something that transcends your own individual experience.
So finding your eternal symbol, it's not a one-and-done kind of deal. It's this ongoing process of self-discovery and then having the guts to live IT, even when it's scary.
You nailed it. And it's about embracing that tension, right? Between knowing our time is limited and still wanting to squeeze every drop out of this life.
You know, it's just amazing to me how we started with Professor Who's, honestly, very relatable anxieties about aging. And now we're having this incredibly profound conversation about, like, the meaning of life.
Isn't it funny how that happens? These things we try so hard to avoid, like thinking about our own mortality, they often lead to the most insightful reflections.
It's true, though, right? It's like we take these deep dives, and they always unearth something so much bigger than we expect.
Totally. And this one, with Professor Who and Albina, what I love is how relatable it is. It's not every day you find philosophy that feels so, I don't know, personal. Like you could be sitting right there with them having this conversation over a cup of coffee.
Totally.
Mm.
But for our listeners who are maybe feeling a little overwhelmed, like, okay, this is all fascinating, but where do I even begin to apply this to my life? Any advice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have these aha moments, but then what? Well, remember how Professor Who talked about those opposing forces? How that tension creates momentum? That's actually a great place to start.
So instead of running away from that fear of death, of irrelevance, we sort of lean into it. How do we even do that?
It's less about leaning in and more about getting curious, I think. Like, ask yourself, what's this fear trying to tell me? What's it revealing about what I truly value?
So if I'm terrified of, I don't know, leaving this world without making some big impact, maybe that means deep down I'm really passionate about leaving things better than I found them.
Exactly. And maybe that impact, it doesn't have to be this huge public thing. Maybe it's the small daily acts of kindness, the relationships you nurture, the positive energy you bring to your little corner of the world.
I love that. And it ties back to what Albina was saying, right? Finding your eternal symbol, it's not always about these monumental achievements. It's about that alignment between your inner world, your values, and how you're actually living your life day in and day out.
And that's where it becomes, well, eternal in a sense, isn't it? Because those values, that inner compass that transcends any single achievement or event.
It's like building a legacy from the inside out,
Yeah.
not chasing after something external, but cultivating something within yourself that then radiates outwards.
You got it. And that, honestly, that's a much more sustainable and I think ultimately more fulfilling way to live.
It's kind of amazing when you think about it, though, right? We started with one professor's, honestly, very relatable anxieties about getting older.
Which we've all felt at some point.
Exactly. And somehow we've ended up with this incredibly profound, hopeful even, conversation about meaning, purpose, and what it means to really live.
It's like those anxieties, those fears, they're not something to be afraid of. They're like guideposts pointing us towards what truly matters.
And that, I think, is a perfect place to wrap up this deep dive.
Couldn't agree more.
So, to our listeners out there, next time you feel that fear creeping in, that fear of time slipping away, of not doing enough, remember this conversation. Remember Professor Ho and Albina, and ask yourself, what is this fear trying to tell me? What is it revealing about what I truly desire? Because on the other side of that fear, that's where you find your eternal symbol. That's where you find meaning. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.